On behalf of the Kogut Center and for those of you visiting Brown, on behalf of Brown, I'm really delighted to welcome you to the second annual Brown University hosted Political Concepts Conference. You'll notice the interesting layout of the room. I think of this as political concepts interior design, and it has a kind of inner circle and outer circle, but think of that as a furniture arrangement only. This is a conversational event, and we found that this arrangement worked out very well for the initial conference last year, but as the 2 days developed, people did seem to shift chairs around according to lines of view and acoustics, etc. So please feel free to do that. And please, everybody, consider this event an event for a discussion and conversation. The length of papers and the length of sessions have been planned very conscientiously for that. I'd like to start by thanking the Kogut Center staff colleagues, Kit Traude, who's standing in the back, and Melissa. I think everybody here knows how much we all depend on the collegiality and work and increasing technical expertise of the staff, and an event like this wouldn't happen without them. In addition to thanking Adi, who is of course the originator and principal thinker of this enterprise, I also want to thank Bonnie Honig and Tim Buse, who have been serving as a kind of internal planning committee. The success of this event last year and the very impressive and enthusiastic presence of Brown colleagues as well as visitors from close by and from far away this year, I think attests to the importance and relevance and inspiring quality of this kind of conference for us, not only here in terms of location, but at this moment in time. So the question of rethinking politics through an original and kind of generative view of conceptual underpinnings and categories is something that speaks to the humanities and speaks to the distribution and redistribution of disciplines, and specifically to how politics are present in the kind of language we use when we think of ourselves either in disciplinary terms or beyond. And of course the broad representation of disciplinary points of origin at this conference equals the representation of local and global participation. And on the latter category, it's a real pleasure for all of us to welcome 4 colleagues from the Minerva Humanities Center at Tel Aviv University. On Monday afternoon, as a kind of happy addition to this conference, there will be a symposium late Monday afternoon on the humanities in Israel-Palestine, so I warmly invite and urge you all to attend that. I think there will be a lot of continuities. And I also want to welcome Jacques Rancière, again, who's been a visitor of the Kogut and Pembroke centers all week. He's been working very hard, including at RISD yesterday, so he's been helping us in this new collaboration that we take very seriously. So welcome to all, and happy Sitzfleisch. And Adi, the mic is yours.
So I'll start again with the thanks to Keith and Traude and to Michael for his warm reception and welcoming attitude toward this project. I would like to just remind those of you who may not be aware of this that this is a project that has several branches, and that we actually the series in Brown is actually part of the initiative of political concept in New York in collaboration with 3 New York universities, NYU, the New School, and Columbia. And that in 2 years from now, this 4 universities will gather again here at Brown. This initiative is also related to an online journal, and papers that are presented here are most welcome to the journal. The journal consists almost mainly of papers presented in these conferences. And I was just told by the coming director of the COVID Center, Amanda, that the administration here has committed its share in the maintenance of this initiative, again in collaboration with the 3 other New York universities. So this is a happy moment for me, at least, to hear the news. And I hope we shall have a successful conference. Thank you.
Is this on? Okay, so we're going to get started with the first session. I'm just waiting for the second member of the first session. Her topic is missing. So that was a good performance start. So we have 2 papers. Each panelist will speak for 25 to 30 minutes. Thank you. I'll pass the mic. Or 25 to 30 minutes. And just to give you a sense, so the way, for those of you who aren't familiar with the concepts approach, we don't have long introductions, just the name and the affiliation of the person speaking. Then we have the 2 papers. Oh, you can't hear me? Oh, is that better? Yeah, even I hear myself better now. Okay, so the concepts approach is just we name the person and their affiliation, no long introductions. We listen to both of the papers on the panel, and then we have a question and answer session in response to both papers together. So that's how we roll. Okay, so our first speaker today will be Elizabeth Weed, who's an affiliated scholar at the Pembroke Center, and her concept is reality. And our second speaker is Thangam Ravindranathan, and from the French department at Brown, and her concept is missing. So Elizabeth Weed first.
Okay, I just want to say the instructions were 30 to 35 minutes, so I'm going to speak a little quickly. My topic is reality, and this is dedicated to Timothy Buse. I realized early on, it's private. I realized early on it was not English literature but French that I was destined to study. English was much too foreign, the reason having everything to do with the problem of reality. Whereas English literature worried a good deal about truth and beauty, the French took a more asymptotic approach, looking rather to vraisemblance and bienséance, verisimilitude and propriety. Those 17th century classical categories were something I could grasp. And from the 17th century all the way through Roland Barthes' Les Faits du Réel, I was safe. And then came speculative realism, a movement animated by philosopher Quentin Meillassoux' 2006 book, After Finitude, an essay on the necessity of contingency. The handouts are, in case it's a little early in the morning for philosophical paradoxes. We'll be coming to them later. The reality to which Meillassoux declares a triumphal return is, as is well known, the very antipode of the reality effect. As a philosophical concept, it flamboyantly separates itself from post-Kantian reality, and in the process dislocates the political, all the while declaring itself politically necessary. And in one way or another, those who affiliate themselves with speculative realism all seem to assert a necessary, urgent relationship between the philosophical return to realism and political necessities. It is at least curious that fairly recently political theorists have called for a quote, political realism, in which the return to realism is a way of framing a return to the political. These are 2 utterly different conceptual registers, of course. And let me say in parentheses that it is difficult to think of a conceptual field that has as little consistency across and within disciplines as that of reality, realism, and the real. 3 terms of enormous historical and formal complexity that I can barely address in the time I have. In any case, in 2009, there was a conference at Birmingham on liberalism and political realism, in which quite heterogeneous political theorists were united in the argument that contemporary liberalism represents a desire to escape from politics and that it's time to return to the political. As Bonnie Honig had written already in her 1993 book, Political Theory and the Displacement of Politics, quoting Honig, those writing from diverse positions, Republican, liberal, and communitarian, converge in their assumption that success lies in the elimination from a regime of dissonance, resistance, conflict, or struggle. They confine politics to the juridical, administrative, or regulative tasks of stabilizing moral and political subjects, building consensus, maintaining agreements, or consolidating communities and identities, end quote. In 2010, the European Journal of Political Theory devoted a special issue to some of the papers of the conference, and in his introduction to the issue, Richard North suggests that the challenge of the realist, quote, return to the political is how to carve out a position between Kantian conceptions of liberalism and accounts of politics that sit rather too comfortably with Machiavelli and Hobbes. One needs, he suggests, a different kind of liberalism, one closer to the early modern version, concerned with preventing public harms rather than realizing moral goods. Clearly, the two returns to realism, the political theoretical and the philosophical, are incommensurable. And yet, perhaps not entirely, as I'll suggest at the end. In 2007, 2 years before the Liberalism and Political Realism Conference at Birmingham, there was a speculative realism workshop at Goldsmith College featuring Ray Brassier, Ian Hamilton Grant, Graham Harman, and Quentin Meillassoux. Although the four have very different critical projects, Brassier, radical nihilism, Grant, neo-vitalism, Harman, object-oriented ontology, it was Meillassoux' 2000 book, Après la finitude, that galvanized the group. And although Meillassoux' original preference was for speculative materialism, he concurred with the choice of speculative realism. Judging by internet activity, blogs, and so forth, speculative realism has caused a good deal of excitement, particularly among young Anglophone scholars in the humanities, excitement nurtured by Harman, who in 2011 published a book on Meillassoux and co-edited a volume titled The Speculative Turn, Continental Materialism and Realism. While speculative realism draws many to its umbrella, the projects are so heterogeneous and the debates so intense and increasingly factionalist that it is difficult to characterize them adequately. However, the one element that still binds the loosely aligned projects is Meillassoux' famous concept of correlationism. Not since Descartes, Meillassoux writes, has the outside, the real, existed in philosophical thinking. Since Kant, he says, quote, thought cannot get outside itself in order to compare the world as it is in itself to the world as it is for us, and thereby distinguish what is a function of our relation to the world from what belongs to the world alone, end quote. By correlation, he means the idea according to which we only ever have access to the correlation between thinking and being, and never to either term considered apart from the other. I wanted to look at speculative realism in order to learn more about current articulations of the critical and the political, correlationism being one of the principal sites of articulation. And in looking more closely at speculative realism, I chose to look most closely at Meillassoux' work because of how radically Meillassoux draws the correlationist line. In his view, for instance, the vitalist formulations that some include within speculative realism, such as Deleuzian life, are what he calls rather strong correlationism, formulations that hypostatize the correlation, revealing that anything that is totally asubjective cannot be. So I look at Meillassoux because the line he cuts is a sharp one. And given the nature of my interest in speculative realism, that sharpness can be limiting. Limiting because, as I said, my interest is in the way so many young scholars today articulate the critical and the political, how they theorize the post-human, the post-anthropological, the Anthropocene, the turn to ontology, the critique of critique. And while some of these scholars engage rigorously with Meillassoux' work, many do not, preferring a more thematized or at least elastic notion of correlationism, combined with a version of his narrative frame. To discuss Meillassoux, then, is not necessarily to discuss the Meillassoux phenomenon. As Alenka Zupancic says, the Meillassoux phenomenon provides the narrative for a certain generalized cultural Unbehagen that she paraphrases thusly. This is Zupancic paraphrasing the Meillassoux phenomenon. After Descartes, we have lost the great outdoors, the absolute outside, the real, and have become prisoners of our own subjective or discursive cage. The only outside we are dealing with is the outside posited or constituted by ourselves, or different discursive practices. And there is a growing discomfort, claustrophobia in this imprisonment, this constant obsession with ourselves, this impossibility to ever get out of the external inside that we have thus constructed. There is also a political discomfort that is put into play here, that feeling of frustrating impotence, of the impossibility of really changing anything, of soaking in small and big disappointments of recent and not so recent history. Hence a certain additional redemptive charm of a project that promises again to break out into the great outside, to reinstitute the real in its absolute dimension, and to ontologically ground the possibility of radical change. End of quote. Indeed, this is the narrative that frames the editor's introduction to the speculative turn, continental materialism, and realism. Acknowledging that their title is a deliberate counterpoint to what they call the now tiresome linguistic turn, they go on to characterize the failings of much of the critical work of the last number of decades, namely phenomenology, structuralism, post-structuralism, deconstruction, and postmodernism. Those critical projects may have claimed to be anti-humanist, they write, but they have failed to remove humanity from the center of their work, thereby leaving reality as no more than the correlate of human thought. And what is at stake is not just a theoretical error, but real danger. Quote, in the face of looming ecological catastrophe and the increasing infiltration of technology into the everyday world, including our bodies, it is not clear that the anti-realist position is equipped to face up to these developments. The danger is that the dominant anti-realist strain of continental philosophy has not only reached the point of decreasing returns, but that it actively limits the capacities of philosophy in our time. End quote. While Meillassoux does add narrative and figurative energy to the speculative realist project, then, this is not, as Upanishad says, what is most interesting about his work. Hence my choice. Either read the generalized narrative complaint about correlationism, which I find interesting and perplexing in its ubiquity, or read the Meillassoux text. Since there is, in fact, no good way to read the generalized complaint in a general way, one can read the Unbehagen symptomatically only by reading the specific texts that deploy it. I'll do the second. That is, rather than reading the more elastic Meillassoux that provides a kind of shibboleth for speculative realism, I'll read the Meillassoux of the sharp cut. And I'll read him in some detail, not because his reality presents itself as a political concept, but because it is taken by many to be one. I suggest then that a closer look at the text can shed light both on the sharp and on the elastic Meillassoux. It must be said that in reading Meillassoux' sharpness, one reads also for a certain pleasure of the text, for the utterly classical elegance of the essay, not only the economy of the arguments, but the formal elegance of the rhetorical and thematic devices. The rhetorical figure that governs the text, of course, is paradox, that seemingly self-contradictory statement that can sometimes be shown to be true, as Meillassoux does unfailingly and with gusto. The oxymorons, or condensed paradoxes of the title, set the stage. After finitude, the necessity of contingency. And if Meillassoux' modus operandi is, as he declares repeatedly, to unravel paradoxes so as to reveal their truths, his technique is, as unraveling indicates, that of reversal, producing radical change by moving backwards, which means that the thematic element that presides over the text is a quip of Hegel's, which Meillassoux cites at the very beginning. This is quoting Meillassoux. We cannot represent the in itself without it becoming for us. Or as Hegel amusingly put it, we cannot creep up on the object from behind so as to find out what it is in itself. End quote. As the reader discovers, creeping up from behind is just what Meillassoux sets out to do. Though creeping actually doesn't tell the whole story, since the reversals and the arguments that support them are performed throughout with displays of panache. It's only as one moves through the rhetorically rich arguments, only later, that the reader starts to register that an entire system of thought has been reversed, and the effect, all the gleeful panache notwithstanding, is one of stealth. Marx's reading of Hegel is described as turning Hegel on his head. Here, with Meillassoux and Kant, reversal is more apt. Meillassoux finds the first reversals in the opening of the first section of the essay titled Ancestrality. He wants to revive the Lacanian or the Cartesian or Lacanian object as a material body with inherent properties. He wants to do this because he wants to claim that it is in fact possible to grasp how thought is able to access an absolute, that is to say, a being, quote, whose separateness from thought is such that it presents itself to us as non-relative to us, as existing whether we exist or not. That's what he means by absolute. We want to grasp this, Meillassoux says, because if we can't think anything that is absolute, we can't make sense of what science tells us about ancestrality, any reality anterior to the appearance of the human species or any recognized form of life. So it is science that concerns Meillassoux, or more accurately, the always vexed relationship between science and philosophy. To understand science for Meillassoux is to understand modern science, that is, science as Galileo and the mathematization of nature. Accordingly, when he speaks of grasping the in itself, he refers to those aspects that are mathematically formulated, arguing that, quote, all those aspects of the object that can be formulated in mathematical terms can be meaningfully conceived as properties of the object in itself. So while sensible or secondary qualities exist only as a relation to a subject, mathematizable properties are exempt from the constraint of such a relation. While Meillassoux' thoughts about science pertain to all modern science and not just that having to do with ancestrality or the diachronic, he focuses on the latter, obviously because it offers him a way to unravel correlationism. In unraveling correlationism, he can approach his primary aim, to demonstrate that the only thing that is necessary is contingency. His entire effort, he writes near the end of the essay, is to bring philosophy more in line with science and to undo what he calls the Kantian catastrophe, that word catastrophe again. The Kantian catastrophe for Meillassoux goes something like this. The Copernico-Galilean event, as he calls it, exposes the vanity of every attempt to provide a metaphysical foundation for The Copernico-Galilean event, as he calls it, exposes the vanity of every attempt to provide a metaphysical foundation for physics. The subsequent Hume event ratifies the first event by demonstrating the fallaciousness of all metaphysical forms of rationality, which is to say the fallaciousness of the absoluteness of sufficient reason, or the principle according to which for everything there must be a reason, why it is thus and so, rather than otherwise, with each reason requiring a reason and so on, leading ultimately to the ontological reason, which alone can provide perfect sole cause that is the cause of itself. This principle of sufficient reason is what the Hume event undoes. In Hume's claim that the world's being thus and so can only be discovered by way of experience, it cannot be demonstrated to be absolutely necessary. This is the challenge to Meillassoux. Meillassoux complains that instead of the Kant event bringing philosophy into line with science at that crucial moment, it turns correlational knowledge into the only philosophically legitimate form of knowledge, the only licit form of philosophy being henceforth conditional knowledge of our relation to the world. It makes the mistake of taking the end of speculative metaphysics to be the end of the absolute, he says. But as Meillassoux asserts, while all metaphysics are speculative, speculation being the kind of thinking that claims to be able to access some form of the absolute, not all speculation is metaphysical. The collapse of the principle of sufficient reason does not, for Meillassoux, equal thought's inability to access the absolute. Meillassoux' project to undo the Kantian catastrophe, to return to the real, entails undoing a set of paradoxes from within that will allow for a speculative absolute without the metaphysical baggage. I'll take a brief look at two of the paradoxes. How am I doing on time? Oh, I'm doing great. I'm doing great. It's hard to read fast when you're talking about this philosophy stuff. You can follow it? That's good. I can follow it because I wrote it. That's the only. First, what Meillassoux calls the paradox of the archifossil, meaning the fossil matter. Now the paradox is on your handout. The fossil matter or material support on the basis of which science estimates ancestral phenomena. For example, an isotope or the luminous emission of a star. The paradox. How can a being manifest being's anteriority to manifestation? Before Kant, Meillassoux says, philosophy thought the problem of substance, Since Kant, it tries to think the correlation, with philosophers competing over who grasps the more originary correlation, the thinker of the subject-object correlation, the language-referent correlation. Whatever the modalities, correlationism maintains the primacy of the relation over the related terms. Right. Never either term apart from the other, never being apart from thinking. The two terms are always co-implicated, co-givenness, co-originary, co-presence. Consciousness is consciousness of something, and the object is co-given with consciousness. This is the always already. Thus, Meillassoux says, with the for itself and the in itself always already co-implicated, correlationist philosophy sees its task as that of rectifying the scientific in itself. When science claims, for instance, that mathematical data allow us to determine that the accretion of the Earth began about 4.56 billion years ago, and that it took place over tens of millions of years, and so forth, the post-Kantian philosopher will take this as admissible as long as it is not interpreted literally. The philosopher's objection, Meillassoux says, is not that there is no witness to the event. Philosophers have long accounted for gaps in perception, the tree falling in the forest, and so forth. What the correlationist philosopher cannot accept is the literal truth of the ancestral statement, that the referent actually existed in the way the statement describes it, because for him, the philosopher, the world is meaningful only as given to a living or thinking being. To speak of the emergence of life is to evoke the emergence of manifestation amidst a world that pre-existed it, which is unacceptable. Hence, the philosopher will grant the consensus among the community of scientists that the accretion of Earth preceded the emergence of hominids by X number of years, but not that the statement is literally true. The difference between the scientist and the philosopher, Meillassoux says, is that for the scientist, the ancestral designates the absence of givenness as such. Although ancestrality is a temporal notion, for science, its definition invokes not distance in time, but anteriority in time. In short, it is not the time of consciousness, but the time of science. And this time of science allows for a break between the scientific statement and its referent. In the discourse of the physicist, Meillassoux says, the mathematical statement about matter is Cartesian, not Pythagorean. That is to say, the claim is not that the being of accretion is inherently mathematical, that the numbers or equations exist in themselves. The physicist's statements remain ideal, he says, insofar as their reality is one of signification. The claim is rather that the statements designate actual properties of the referent. Meillassoux grants that the scientific statements are revisable, of course, if falsified and supplanted, but the relationship between statement and referent remains one of truth, not correlation. The archifossil paradox, how can a being manifest being's anteriority to manifestation, is thus unraveled to demonstrate that manifestation itself emerged with the emergence of life and is thus not the givenness of a world, and that thought is in a position to think manifestation's emergence in being as well as a being anterior to manifestation. A quick look at the second paradox. In order to preserve the meaning of ancestral statements without regressing to dogmatism, we must uncover an absolute necessity that does not reinstate any form of absolutely necessary entity. In other words, we must think an absolute necessity without thinking anything that is absolutely necessary. The danger of dogmatism is the one political concern that Meillassoux raises in the essay. However frustrating the casual disregard one sees today for scientific truths, resurgent religiosity is what most enrages or engages Meillassoux. With the indignity of a Voltaire, he describes religious beliefs today as enjoying seemingly complete immunity, as he says, from the constraints of conceptual rationality. Even worse, he writes, to the discomfort of some of his followers, the critique of ontotheology primarily served to undermine the Judeo-Christian tradition with its rational affinities, thereby opening the way for God knows what irrational fanaticisms of various sorts. Whatever the historical reasons for the resurgence of religiosity and violence, he says, the condemnation of fanaticism is only ever made in ethical and political terms, never in the name of the falsity of the contents. So how to find a necessity that is not dogmatic? We don't want to return to the absolutism of metaphysics, he says, which turned illusions into similarly into seemingly necessary entities, and we value ideology critique, which similarly demonstrates that a social situation that presents itself as inevitable is actually contingent. Since we don't want to reverse these important critiques, since we don't want to return to the pre-critical, we need an absolute necessity that does not reinstate any form of absolutely necessary entity. Here, roughly, is how Meillassoux gets there. Very rough. Kant maintains it is impossible to derive a priori forms of thought from a system or principle capable of endowing them with absolute necessity. For Kant, these forms of thought can only be described, not deduced. They can be thought but not known. And for the strong correlationists who follow, Meillassoux says, like Heidegger, they can be neither known nor thought. And because these a priori forms of knowledge cannot be deduced, they represent facticity, says Meillassoux, not absolutes. They are structural invariants that supposedly govern the world, but they constitute a fact rather than an absolute, because one cannot ground their necessity. What I experience with facticity, he writes, is not an objective reality, but rather the unsurpassable limits of objectivity confronted with the fact that there is a world. We might grasp the possibility of things being otherwise, he says, but possibility is always within quotation marks. Facticity is the mark of our finitude, the limit of what we can know, pushing the critique of sufficient reason to the extreme. So let us acknowledge that, quote, facticity is not knowledge of the actual possibility of the wholly other, but rather our inability to establish its impossibility. Acknowledging that, Meillassoux says, is to absolutize unreason, and absolutizing unreason is our only alternative if we ever wish to escape the cage of correlationism. It is thus facing the limits of facticity and arriving at the principle of unreason that we can be open to radical contingency. Quote, there is no reason for anything to be or to remain the way it is. Everything must, without reason, be able not to be and or be able to be other than it is, end quote. This is not Hegel's metaphysical contingency subsumed under a rational totality, he says. To posit a speculative, non-metaphysical totality, Meillassoux turns, like his teacher Alain Badiou, to Georg Cantor's theorem on the mathematical conceivability of the detotalization of being qua being, the not all. This, I'm almost done, this mathematical not all also enables Meillassoux to counter the common sense argument that things don't seem to be all that contingent, that the laws of nature, for example, seem pretty reliable. His rebuttal is that speculative contingency is not chance and is not susceptible to probability because probabilistic reasoning depends on a totality of conceivable possibilities. He concedes that axioms other than Cantor's might come along. Quote, we can't rule out a priori that there might be one in which the realm of possible worlds would constitute a determinate numerical totality. But this, at least, must be accorded to us. We have at our disposal one axiomatic capable of providing us with the resources for thinking that the possible is untotalizable. And that's how the paradox is unraveled. Okay, that's the Meillassoux, that's the correlationism in particular that has captured the imagination of a whole generation of young scholars, particularly the correlationism part. The contingency part is not quite as popular. So what is there to say about Meillassoux' politics? Other than his desire to cure dogmatism with truth, he offers nothing in After Finitude in the way of a theory of the political or political change. Some argue that, indeed, the importance of After Finitude is one entirely internal to philosophy. One reader, Nathan Brown, argues to the contrary that in distinguishing between the real and its knowledge, Meillassoux is actually re-engaging with Althusser's thinking on dialectical materialism or the theory of scientific practice. It's a whole big long argument. Alex Galloway argues differently, focusing on what he sees as Meillassoux' regressive turn to mathematics. There may have been a time when mathematics was sufficiently outside human experience that it allowed a window onto the absolute, Galloway writes, but today calculation and mathematics are precisely coterminous with the human experience. Another reader, Reza Negarestani, reflects on the strange paradoxical nature of speculative realism, that in its extreme anti-humanistic forms, actually undoes the horizon of human agency, and in doing so contributes to the very sense of capitalism as a limitless force. Nagarastani argues not that we should give up on speculation, but that we should abandon what he calls the romantic anti-humanism and give more theoretical attention to the inhuman. I also situate my argument in the distinction between the anti-human and the inhuman, though in a different register. The editors of the speculative turn tell us of the urgent need to correct the failings of decades of correlationist thinking. In spite of all the anti-humanistic claims, they say humanity remains at the center of that thought and renders it impossible to deal with the looming catastrophes that face us. As Nagarastani suggests, such a polemic seems to have less to do with the challenges of the abyssal vistas unlocked by science than with anxieties regarding the limits of human faculties. Certainly, Mayasu's bravura performance has the energy that one finds in the most flamboyantly defensive grandiosity. Although Mayasu's tone is not without a touch of irony from time to time, reason's achievement to derive the principle of unreason and to permit the necessity of contingency is undiminished. Reason lives. In the destruction of correlationism, reason thus survives as speculation. What is meant not to survive is the for us. The imperative of speculative realism is to break out of the prison house of language and phenomenological consciousness and to think a reality that is not the correlate of our thought, not for us. Zizek comments at one point that our challenge lies not with the great outdoors, but with the indoors, with the subject itself. Indeed. What the philosophical problematic can't know, what it can't seem to see, is that there has never been a for us for the thinking subject. It takes a very careful cordoning off of conscious reason to be able to collapse the phenomenological with the proprietary for us. And it takes a careful disregard for psychoanalysis not to take into account the particular violence that accompanies the speaking subject's confrontation with the not for us. That is what Lacan's real is all about. Not about a finitude that allows for reason's speculative withdrawal of reason, but about a real that cuts off thought, a real that is not anti-human but inhuman. It is not for us. It is the not for us that is associated with intense psychic anxiety, and it is the not for us that can make defenses against castration so violent and so dangerous. Speculative realism's call to rid critical thought of the contamination of the for us can seem a bit like what psychoanalysis calls a flight to health, in which the patient flees to a symptom-free state, leaving unanalyzed conflicts behind. In this case, a flight from an unanalyzed for us into some kind of purified ontological register. And the nature of that flight is what allows me to bring together, however tenuously, the speculative realists and the political realists I mentioned earlier. For there is something of liberalism's moralistic displacement of political conflict in the speculative movement as inflected by Mayassu. In a 2010 interview, and this is the end, Mayassu gives some insights into his conception of politics. Among his rather startling, very startling thoughts, the notion that since real change is outside our grasp, the individual can contribute to the eternal possibility of social justice by being open to radical thinking. It is an individual matter, not a collective one. Since formal politics is limited by finitude, politics can, quote, avoid the totalitarian temptation of collective action, end quote. All messianism, all eschatological desire, he says, is to be redirected to another sphere of existence, that of individual subjectivity, private life. We thus see that Mayassu's stylistic preference for contained reversal is not limited to the text, but is operative in the quietist withdrawal of politics itself. One more sentence. This is not to say, finally, that science studies and other critical discourses don't have an epistemological challenge in thinking the limits of the anthropological. It's just that those limits cannot be construed as the for us. That's it.
So this is Thangam, and the concept is missing.
We may need to share if there are not enough of those. Yes, thank you. So, how's this? Okay. So missing is not so much a concept, perhaps, here as a conceit, a trick, and I cannot say for sure whether I am the one playing the trick or the one tricked. Here's how I might quickly tell this embarrassing tale, my sticky, burdensome, compromising preface, less like an albatross than like a dog. There is a part of me that feels secretly, inordinately anxious in the presence of concepts. Do not worry, I said to that part of me. You and I can come to an understanding. We shall find a concept that allows you a way out. When I go in there and say that missing is my political concept, you will know how to read it as my political concept is missing. So we will continue to walk together a little longer, you and I. Only that part of me watches my every word now to see whether I keep to my promise. With every minute, with each sentence, it senses the danger that I may betray it. Sometimes I wish I could escape its expectant eyes on me, its intense, panting attentiveness to each of my moves. How very literal it is in its understanding of promises. Let me be, I sometimes think, but I dare not say it out. Let me go and live in the world of concepts. But its continual disquiet dogs me. It seems to fear that beyond my arrangement with it, I have other arrangements with the world, and that in the final analysis it will be paved over by concepts. Along with its fears come also disproportionate delusions, for it has come to think it is the missing to my concept, what will always be missing in my concepts, that it is in fact concepts' way of missing themselves. It thinks that precisely because it cannot be grasped by a concept, it is the one place of truth behind all my constantly churned out postures of bad faith. It plants in my readings and my writings portraits of itself. So I have 5 parts, portraits of itself. And in each, the dog plays the missing to my concept. And in each, it also arguably makes me say things I do not want to say. So, part 1, probability of a dog. For a long time now, I have been troubled by this passage in Jean Rollin's 2009 book, Un chien mort après lui, or A Dead Dog After Him. This is quote 1. By dint of, and this is my translation of à force de, so by my continued searching for. So by dint of searching texts for occurrences of stray dogs, one ends up developing or fancying that one is developing a sort of instinct or experience that makes one sense several lines away their imminent appearance. But it can happen that the early signs are misleading and that this expectation is disappointed, expectation or wait, attente. The scene or passage in question giving you then the impression that there are dogs missing. Il y manque des chiens. Un chien mort après lui, A Dead Dog After Him, borrows its title from the concluding words of Malcolm Lowry's 1947 novel, Under the Volcano, describing the wretched end met by its drunken protagonist. The line is, somebody threw a dead dog after him down the ravine, however that's pronounced. Jean Rollin's book follows a curious idée fixe. Steeped in 19th century travelogues and historical novels, he travels to cities in post-communist Europe and the global south, tracking stray dogs. And while stray dogs might not seem to be ecological indicators in the same nice way as are, say, frogs or hedgehogs, whose populations expressively reflect and measure the life-sustaining properties of natural environments, they are certainly telling indicators of a particular unfinishedness of the work of the political over environment, one could say, in the sense that their presence anywhere, invariably bears witness to poverty, national crisis or transition, the inefficacy, in any case, of state or local authorities in managing the secondary ecology of urban spaces. Because Rollin inverts the realist relation of priority between text and place, looking, for example, in Cairo for a certain kind of big yellow mongrel dog that Flaubert had seen 150 years later. The cities, squares, and neighborhoods he visits in the course of his curious quest often assume an unreal, ghostly aspect. Except it is not the places themselves, of course, that are ghostly. It is the dogs, those creatures of furtive ways and brief, intense lifespans. It is the searching for them that turns the places into strange things, settings of suspense, and that turns dark alleyways, vacant lots, public gardens after hours into scenes of probability of a dog. Such probability is not necessarily consummated. Stray dogs, elusive enough when you're actually looking for them, are even more so when you come looking for them a century later. Rollin would be particularly unsuccessful in Cairo. At times it is clear that the purpose of the journey is not exactly to find the dogs, for when a dog is found, it can hardly be beheld for long, and in any case, there is hardly anything to say about it. Rather, various kinds of texts, the Orientalist travel writings are referred to, but also novels and stories from various parts of the world, famous remarks, media reports, histories of dogs, other kinds of studies of the species, letters, conversations in the field featuring dogs, and so on, carry any number of dogs that seem to add themselves seamlessly to the ones Rollin does find, and to fill in for the ones that he doesn't. One of the book's wages, then, is to use writings about places of the world as still meaningful, indeed all meaningful guides and maps to those places. In this sense, perhaps, what is in one sense non-realist is in another sense hyper-realist, given the literalism with which Rollin goes around metaphorically carrying a passage from Flaubert or Nerval in hand to ask passers-by, "Excuse me, would you happen to have seen this dog?" Of course, we see notices of missing dogs and missing cats from time to time, in reality, in our present here and now, that is. And I think of those, and of why it is that with the notion of there being stray dogs missing, missing seems to find its most unnerving object, an object eerily equal to missing's own conceptual complication or defection. Missing's dog, I could call this, taking my cue from a book by Alice Kuzniar, Melancolia's Dog. Whose melancholia is it, asks Kuzniar, who in asking this puzzles through the fact that around dogs, the distribution of subjects and moods may turn fuzzy. The most interesting literary and philosophical writings on dogs, to my mind, I think here of Vicky Hearn, John Berger, or Colin Diane, and actually pockets of Sartre and Deleuze, as we shall see, all suggest this in their very rhetoric and syntax. Language goes weird around dogs. It is intimately dislocated, because something happens to the clarity of the difference between outside and inside, proper and improper, human and animal, concepts and life, perhaps. Perhaps the dogs disturb the count because, to quote Roger Grenier, quoting Rilke in the difficulty, in fact, misquoting Rilke, I think, because I couldn't find it, in The Difficulty of Being a Dog, or Les Larmes du Lys translates as The Difficulty of Being a Dog, dogs are neither excluded nor included. And if that seems like a paradoxical limbo to occupy, how much more soberly and really paradoxical that occupied by stray dogs, chiens errants in French, and therefore in Haiti, wandering dogs, perro vago in Spanish, and therefore in Latin America, vague dogs, are by definition dogs without a proper place. If without a place to begin with, where do we begin to think they're missing? A dog missing a place thus gives way to a place missing a dog, recalling the weird arithmetic of the Red Queen's riddle in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. And this is quote 2, and I'm just reading the lines in bold. Take a bone from a dog, what remains? Answer, the dog would lose its temper. Then, if the dog went away, its temper would remain. Replace temper with place, and you get a placeless dog and a dogless place. And the silly word trick seems to yield an obscure truth. But a truth about what exactly? About two perfectly inverse halves that do not join nor cancel each other out, but somehow make for any number of stray dogs on the one hand and any number of missing stray dogs on the other. And I am troubled by this, because some part of me has always known this forked scene of probabilities, has always felt this forked scene of probabilities to be the scene of the difference between something like the East and something like the West. But that is part of me. The rest of me, thank goodness for such rest, such restfulness, will have none of it. Let it not be said that the dog ate my concept. Part 2 is called the median thesis. A chapter of Roger Grenier's book, Les Larmes d'Ulysse, translated as The Difficulty of Being a Dog, opens with an oft-spoken, I don't know if this is a word, that's soft-spoken without an S, but anyway, often uttered line, uttered by entranced dog owners. He is missing only speech. This formulation, il ne lui manque que la parole, is listed in the dictionary entry for the verb manquer as an idiomatic phrase used starting in the late 19th century to indicate that an animal is very intelligent or that a portrait is very vivid. Surprise, surprise, several examples given in the Littré's manquer entry feature animals, as for instance the sentence taken from Jules Renard's diary in 1904, quel admirable animal que le cochon. Il ne lui manque que de savoir faire lui-même son boudin. What an admirable animal the pig is. It is missing only the skills to itself make the sausage. Animals stand in the history of Western thought and use in an overdetermined relation to missing. Missing's most active, most paradigmatic agents. So much so that if animals didn't exist, perhaps they would have had to be invented for missing's sake. And in a sense, of course, they have been invented, no less and no more than the human. The animal is a series of missings, an aggregate of missings, the cubist collage of various missings. It is by definition what is missing all those things that are deemed to be properties of the human. That is, and this is part of quote 3, the first terms in bold, clothing, speech, reason, the logos, history, laughter, mourning, burial, the gift, etc. As Jacques Derrida recalls as his argumentative premise in The Animal That Therefore I Am. The key term here is the etc., indicating an including but not limited to logic, an open set, a dynamic, still unfinished negative production. So that it matters less what the animal is missing than the fact that it will always be missing something. Thus, Derrida's unfinished list is followed immediately by a parenthesis, which is the rest of quote 3, the list of what is proper to man. So read here the list of what is missing in the animal, always forms a configuration from the first moment. For that very reason, it can never be limited to a single trait, and it is never closed. Structurally speaking, it can attract a non-finite number of other concepts, beginning with the concept of a concept. Derrida's critique here is aimed at the deep logic of a whole history of Western thinking, where figures most prominently and also poignantly Heidegger and what is sometimes referred to as Heidegger's median thesis on animals. Between stones that have no world and humans who are world-forming stand animals who are essentially, inescapably poor in world, because they are in the world, do live and die, can bask on a rock in the sun. I refer to Heidegger's famous description of the lizard. Yet they cannot enter into a relation with rocks, with the sun, with being, or with death as such. That is precisely, one might say, because they are missing concepts for these, and more precisely, to follow Derrida here, because they are missing even the concept of a concept. Derrida's answer, his signature argumentative strategy, otherwise known as deconstruction, would not be to restitute what is said to be missing to the animal kingdom, but rather to worry away at both sides of the missing, at what it refuses or negates on one side and what it produces on the other. On the one hand, it is legitimate to ask, so this is the way the argument would go, on the one hand, it is legitimate to ask whether the animal does not obviously have some relationship to its environment, to its own body, and to its death, and whether in this sense there may not be something that precedes and exceeds the as such of conceptual grasp, a way of relating, of tracing, that would in fact describe the non-masterable work of significance beneath all our concepts. On the other hand, are we really so sure, Derrida would ask, that humans themselves relate to being, world, and death, or rocks, as such, that we do not also stand there vis-à-vis these things in various relationships of missing? I am reminded here of Sartre on bad faith as that perpetual, inescapable risk of human consciousness, and I quote, "Bad faith is possible only because sincerity is conscious of missing its goal by its very nature." But let not Sartre make me miss my own goal here, in suggesting that Derrida, in his two-pronged undoing of the missing machine, brings concepts, claims, and missings to blur and bleed into each other. I wanted to point also at one of the furthest stakes of this blurring and bleeding, for there is a point at which a point de basculement is reached, a switching of places, a point of reversal, by which the direction of the missing is reversed. Perhaps it is the peculiar bifid nature of the verb missing, the tense distribution of its transitive and intransitive senses, to be missing something versus to be merely or sheerly missing, that is here at play, opening a breach in my thinking. At any rate, the way I understand it is that the secret reason why Derrida cannot do away with Heidegger's median thesis of animals' poverty in world is that it is impossible to completely do away with the suspicion that this median thesis imperceptibly carries as its shadow an irrational prophetic knowledge about its inverse, or more strongly yet, carries, sealed, concealed, as its inverse proposition, a self-fulfilling prophecy. That would be to say, behaving as we have, as if animals are poor in world, we will wittingly or unwittingly have made possible that moment at which, or that way in which, the world is poor in animals. One could restate this in fairly non-controversial material historical terms, the idea of animals as being impoverished, insufficiently meaningful forms of life, has accompanied and authorized notably the destruction or devitalizing of habitats for most species and the mass industrialized zombie production of a chosen few. But it is on the conceptual level that we perceive the real trick, as it were. I cannot find now, and therefore perhaps only imagine, the place precisely and literally in Derrida where he alerts us to the danger of the concept sliding by means of a stealthy, syllogistic aberration into obscene indirection. If animals are missing world, it may not be possible to recognize the point at which the world, in turn, will be missing animals. Thus, in the final telling, the animal facing the world will have had the resistance not of a concept, but rather of a style, to follow D.A. Miller's definition in his beautiful little book on Jane Austen. Style is my way of shutting out the world that would otherwise shut me out. Part 3, like a dog. Writers give themselves away when they write about dogs, writes Roger Grenier in The Difficulty of Being a Dog. He notes that many of his writer friends appeared a bit too interested when he told them he was writing a book about dogs in literature. A fatal mistake, he writes. Since then, everyone has been urging me not to forget. Remember that dog on page 179 of the novel I published 12 years ago? I hope you're going to talk about him. It is to Roger Grenier that I owe the discovery of an extraordinary moment of the family idiot, in The Family Idiot, Sartre's 5-volume existentialist biography of Gustave Flaubert. And this is quote 4. I have seen fear and rage grow in a dog. We were talking about him. He knew it instantly because our faces were turned toward him as he lay dozing on the carpet and because the sounds struck him with full force as we were addressing him. Nevertheless, we were speaking to each other. He felt it. Our words seemed to designate him as our interlocutor and yet reached him blocked. He did not quite understand either the act itself or this exchange of speech, which concerned him far more than the usual hum of our voices, that lively and meaningless noise with which men surround themselves, and far less than an order given by his master or a call supported by a look or gesture. Or rather, for the intelligence of these humanized beasts is always beyond itself, lost in the imbroglio of its presence and its impossibilities, he was bewildered at not understanding what he understood. He began by waking up, bounding towards us, but stopped short, then whined with an uncoordinated agitation, and finished by barking angrily. This dog passed from discomfort to rage, feeling at his expense the strange reciprocal mystification, which is the relationship between man and animal. But his rage contained no revolt. The dog had summoned it to simplify his problems. Once calmed, he went off to the next room and returned, much later, to frolic and lick our hands. Sartre's anguished dog demonstrates how culture or language, or is intended to demonstrate in this passage, how culture or language can, in the domestic animal, become the pure negation of animality by itself. The animal, writes Sartre, experiences through its prolonged contact with humans the intuition of a minute distance removing it from its own nature, but without the delight of turning this negating distance into active self-consciousness, let alone transcendence through meaning. Instead, this dog is simply haunted by the sense of something missing, writes Sartre. But in French, it's hanté par cette absence. The occasion for this anecdote is Sartre's conjecture in these early pages of L'idiot de la famille that Flaubert, as an unloved child, did not perhaps start out very differently from a domestic animal. Docile, passive, he experienced his initiation to human culture as alien to him, did not see that there were acts that could be claimed as his own. He too suffers from the obsession with something missing, writes Sartre, because culture forms him and yet remains alien to him, makes him feel deprived. He is already spoken, like our lapdogs, but too late. He is spoken to rarely, distractedly, and unsmilingly. For all intents and purposes, the bewildered dog serves Sartre's analysis of human self-consciousness and freedom as being injunctions to overcome one's own dog life, as it were. That is, so turn one's rage into revolt, or at least responsibility. No doubt is seen here the influence over Sartre's thinking of that of Heidegger, for whom the pet dog, even while it lives with us and eats with us, in fact does not eat as we eat, but simply feeds, does not exist as we exist, but merely lives, and so on. And this is from Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, due to not having language and conceptual awareness. Still, that Sartre in fact goes further here might give us pause. He lends the dog awareness that it is missing something. In its suffering, the dog is not only the missing of concepts made flesh, which it is in any case, whether it is aware of it or not, but also turns, at those moments when it is forced into awareness of this, into the very paradoxical space of a concept-less awareness of concepts being missing. An excruciating space, of course, to contemplate, and if it may initially appear a conceptual fiction, concepts' fantasy of their own absence, the bleakness of it is unnerving to no end. It verges within the context of the passage on describing Sartre's néant, or nothingness, of course. I wonder whether it is not also something like the Lacanian will. In any case, it is a space that we cannot bear, and that cannot bear us. At its most awful, when allowed to become a realized space and duration, it is the space of a radical loss of voice and of world, as described in accounts of extreme forms of dehumanization, torture, slavery, as history has forced us to find the conceptual means to describe. I think here, of course, of certain works of Elaine Scarry, Giorgio Agamben, Colin Diane, and others writing on the making and unmaking of persons and world. I would say biopolitics, except that for a reason I have only just begun to understand, this word has, from the first time I heard it, made me feel miserable and uncomprehending. My heart pounds. You will say, or rather Tim will say, and it is true, that a range of political concepts have that effect on me. But this one more than any. And I feel this so strongly that I feel I must be speaking for all of us. There are concepts that make us feel like a dog. They speak of us deeply, gravely, yet to us only distractedly, unsmilingly. We stand formulated, spoken as it were, but precisely as if identified and pinned by that part of us that can no longer wander nor hide, and yet cannot speak, and yet cannot speak, for it has no words of its own, no world of its own, indeed no body of its own, so that it must borrow its body from our concepts, and thus fears with every word that it might be definitively named and heard. Part 4 is called Nowhere in Itself. I take this to be what Colin Diane means when she writes in The Law is a White Dog, that only with dogs before us and beside us can we understand the making and unmaking of persons. In this strange and moving book, Diane retraces and connects the various fictional, analogical, phantasmatic, ghostly, and compensatory ways in which the dog, and particularly the stray dog, has, through European and American legal history, prefigured, accompanied, belied, and served as the ineradicable residue of the arrival of the human at personhood. The dog is a paradox, empty of substance, writes Diane. The dog exists nowhere in itself. Rather, it is a reminder of the ambivalence of legal processes that have, on the one hand, produced personhood and made it possible to bear rights, even while, on the other hand, producing forms of disfigured personhood, stigmatized bodies, banished outside the body politic, deprived of the right to have rights. No country kills more dogs or imprisons more people than the United States, notes Diane. So 1.2 million dogs are euthanized every year in the US. The dog is an overdetermined figure in Colin Dayan's analysis. It is what haunts the law as a reminder of the law's capacity to sustain archaic debris. But more importantly, it is that limit case that continually recalls that banishment, expulsion, radical depersonalizing are not exceptional instances where the law is suspended, forgotten, or weak, but rather where it shows its never renounced ritual magical side, its power to make unreal the claims of personhood and thus to produce ghosts. In the dog, writes Dayan, the natural person that is sacrificed upon entering society haunts, as if reborn not in the spirit, but within the flesh of civil society. Part 5 is called The Ecology of Stray Dogs. This is a silent part. So it's just the graph. Sorry, and this, I should say something about, so the graph comes from this book published in 1971, The Ecology of Stray Dogs, and it's a study of the stray dog population in Baltimore. As far as I understand, there aren't really any stray dogs anymore in Baltimore. And this graph shows the different circadian rhythms of dogs, people, and children. So I guess I can't quite get over this graph in terms of how it might invite us to think about what is missing when stray dogs are missing. Conclusion. This conclusion is called aux aguets. You'll know what that is in a minute. So you will say that I have read Sartre's dog much too gravely. After all, he does return to frolic and lick our hands. What is more, such misery, if and when found in a human, Sartre suggests, would be overcome by love, the missing mediation, his words, by which one is invited to recognize oneself as having wholly entered the world. From this solace should be drawn, and indeed political projects. Yet the anguish of Sartre's dog is hard to forget, because never transcended in the dog, to be transcended only in the human. And in fact, love is valued differently on each side of this, because for Sartre, even without love, the human has self-presence, self-consciousness, and therefore hope of proceeding freely and responsibly. Whereas to the dog, even with love, the world still arrives blocked, carrying figures of its own missing. Reading through literature and philosophy for the dog, as it were, one finds it to be one finds the dog then to be precisely in a tense, somehow inordinate, yet essential relationship with the literary and the philosophical. So if in Colin Dayan's words, the dog exists nowhere in itself, I have wanted to dwell here a while, not at all in the end on the dog as a species or even as a theme, but as a place all the more inescapable in that from it the dog itself may be missing. And so I will do the annoying thing of ending with a quote, but what a quote that is. So it's from Deleuze's The Fold, and it's a place where he describes the Baroque understanding, well, both the Baroque investment in animals, in animal souls for illustrating certain universal things about the soul, but also in the Baroque's unsettling of abstractions through a different kind of perception. How could a pain follow a pleasure if 1,000 tiny pains, or rather half pains, were not already dispersed in pleasure, which will then be united in conscious pain? However abruptly I may flog my dog who eats his meal, the animal will have experienced the minute perceptions of my stealthy arrival on tiptoes, my hostile odor, and my lifting of the rod that subtend the conversion of pleasure into pain. He's commenting here on a passage in Leibniz, sorry, I should have said. Tiny perceptions are as much the passage from one perception to another as they are components of each perception. They constitute the animal or animated state par excellence, disquiet. These are pricklings, aiguillons, or little foldings that are no less present in pleasure than in pain. The pricklings are the representative of the world in the closed monad, the animal that anxiously looks about, l'animal aux aguets, or the soul that watches out, l'âme aux aguets, signifies that there exist minute perceptions that are not integrated into present perception, but also minute perceptions that are not integrated into the preceding one and that nourish the one that comes along. So it was that. C'était donc ça. Thank you.
Yes, sorry. Okay, great. Well, thanks to both of our panelists for excellent, thought-provoking papers. It's 10:37. We have until 11:15 for discussion, question and answer, and then we have a break for coffee, so hang in there. Although, if the need presses, the coffee's right there. So the floor is open for questions. Yeah, Stephen.
Thank you both for your papers. Elizabeth, at the end of your talk, you were mentioning the individual versus the collective, and sort of the challenge that dichotomy poses, and the challenge to politics of siding sort of with the individual. So I was wondering if you could say more about your response to that challenge. I mean, one initial thing that struck me is that individuals are just inevitably part of the collectives in one way or another, shape individuals in such a way that you just couldn't make too much of a disjunction out of that. I wondered if you could just say more about how you would respond to the challenge to politics of that disjunction.
That was Maya Su, not me.
Right.
And I wonder if I could just read you what he says, because his way of cordoning off the individual is in the context of necessary contingency, right? That everything is contingent. So he says he's asked about politics and about his maybe belief in God. He says, here's how I look at it. If I take super-contingency seriously, then I ought to divide the possibility into potentialities and virtualities is those that are not submitted to laws, so it's virtualities he's talking about. Thus it is pointless to ask, so if potentialities can be probabilized, in my view, virtualities cannot, by reason of the transfinite character of the number of possibles. Thus, it is pointless to ask what the chances are of one virtuality arising rather than another, or to think that a particular virtuality has an infinitely small chance of arising in view of the immense number of other possibilities. Okay, that's the world, right? On the other hand, I, Maya Su, can do two things with respect to the virtual that are able to transform my subjective relationship with the experience of the world. First of all, I can grant prominence to the most radical novelties of the past, so the thoughts that he likes, like the emergence of life understood as a set of qualitative contents by contrast with an inorganic matter that feels neither sensation nor perception. There goes objects, object-oriented ontology. He hates it. Then the emergence, that's one thing he'll think about, what he's going to give privilege to, these thoughts. Another thought that he's going to give privilege to is the emergence of rational thought, by contrast with a life that cannot attain the concept of the infinite, like a dog, for example, or eternal truth of the mathematical or speculative type. Those are the things that he's going to sit and think about. This having been done, I can ask what next event would be that is capable of just as much novelty in comparison with thought as thought compared with life or life with matter. For if we grant that thought can attain the absolute, that is to say, contingency conceived as necessary, then nothing can transcend thought except for the reemergence of thought in accordance with the reign of a rigorously egalitarian justice among thinking individuals. We are in the framework of an analogy of incommensurabilities, and I don't understand what he means by that. If time is capable of a novelty just as radical in comparison with thought as thought with life or life with matter, this novelty can only be the emergence of egalitarian justice for the living and the dead. So this is something that is going to emerge. You can see why people are asking him about God, okay? Then he says, consequently, religious messianism or revolutionary radicalism can be rethought within the framework of an attempt at radical equality for the living and the dead, an event that is contingent but nonetheless eternally possible, totally improbabilizable, and outside the grasp of our action and even our universe, insofar as it's subject to its own laws. This is the part that is so weird. I mean, not that that last part wasn't weird. This eternal possible frees me from suffering over the appalling misfortune of those who have experienced atrocious deaths, allows me to escape being paralyzed by an impossible mourning for the atrocities of the 20th century, and also permits me to invest my energy in an egalitarian politics that has become conscious of its limits. Okay, now there's going to be some investment in egalitarian politics, but we don't know what that means. Indeed, politics is delivered from all charges of messianism, since eschatological awaiting is entirely recuperated by individual subjectivity. This happens only in the subject, not in the political formation. The partition of tasks, individual messianism, political finitude, allows us to avoid the totalitarian temptation of collective action. We can efficiently expel the eschatological desire from politics only by allowing this desire to be unfolded openly in another sphere of existence, such as private life or philosophy. So that's my only answer, because this is not my formulation. And I don't fully understand this formulation, and if you do, it would be helpful to me. I mean, if you have a more sympathetic reading of it than I do, because you can tell mine is totally unsympathetic. So, does that, what do you think? I mean, you know all about the eschatological and the messianic, and
Yeah, no, it's not my formulation either. I mean, I guess I was wanting to hear more about, in your assessment, you know, how are you going to respond to that sort of? I was thinking of the dichotomy between the individual and the collective, but now, you know, with the fuller reading, there's a lot more going on as well, including the messianism and the egalitarianism.
I think there's this strange problem in Measu, in that there's nothing missing, and yet everything's possible. I mean, so there's there's the not all, right? The set theory idea of the not all, and yet everything about his thinking, including his style, and that quote from D.A. Miller about style is what keeps me out of the world. Style is what keeps me out of the world is a perfect description of Measu's position. So you know, he can simultaneously keep his closure, which means a non-relationality, not related to the collective. There's no point having collective relationships because there is nothing to make that. To make there be any probability that anything will happen from that connection. So there's this retreat, this quietism, what I see is like quietism, this retreat into sitting around and thinking radical thoughts. Now, I'm absolutely open to people who know Measu better than I do, who would have a different reading of that, but that's how I see it.
So
I'm just going to footnote a little comment and say that the idea that because something has a temptation to it means that we don't do it anymore, it seems odd to me, and maybe that's the place to think that if collective action has a totalitarian temptation, we don't do collective action, as opposed to looking for ways to overcome that temptation. Seems purist, which fits with your reading, which is why that's a footnote. Okay, so I'm keeping a queue, and we take questions from anyone in the room, not just those at the literal and figurative table. And so please signal me, and I'll add you to the queue if you have questions. The next one is from Amanda Anderson.
Thanks for those wonderful papers. So I have two questions for Elizabeth. One follows on the previous question, and it's I would just sort of try to re-angle it a little bit. At the end of your paper, you basically introduce the Lacanian real as an alternative, or an appropriate alternative to the absolute reality of mea su. And my question would just be, what is your concept of politics? Because, and I think that's a little bit what Stephen was asking, which is to say that you have a critique of that which is not appropriately encompassed by mea su. So leaving mea su aside entirely. What I can draw from the critique of liberalism is, there was a fleeting comment about the repression of conflict, and then there's a psychoanalytic emphasis at the end of the paper, and so the question is just, if you put, if those are the two sort of Weedian precepts that are put forth, and I would just say, what's the concept of politics that were meant, that would be built out of that? That's question one. Question two is, I was very struck by and intrigued and wanted to hear more about the repeated references to a younger generation of scholars who are receiving mea su in a certain way, and that reception must be contradistinguished entirely from the text. And so I was wondering if you had an intellectual sociology that would begin to explain that, or amplify that, because it's very intriguing, and I feel like there's more behind the observation that you might have to say.
I wish I did. I mean, can I start with the second one? Because I have to tell you, this is not, mea su is not my stuff, but for at least 5 or 6 years, I have been fascinated, and some part of it, like part of our postdocs at the Pembroke Center, but going to conferences, reading. I'm fascinated with, as I said, the critique of critique, and the critique of the inadequacy of the anti-humanism that they see. And I really have wanted to know, where does that go? Because for me, criticism and thinking, no matter what one is thinking, is all political. And so I never made the ethical turn. I always remained with the political. And so I'm fascinated by this stuff. So I totally immersed myself. From New Year's until now, I have totally immersed myself in this world. I have read so many blogs. I have read so many essays. I have just gone into the world. The world is 99.9% male. It is very international, very international. I mean, people from not only Slovenia, but Iran and here and there and everywhere, and very young. Because when you look up these people, you find out that they're postdocs, or they're graduate students, or they're assistant professors. So so it's a youthful movement, and I was looking for what it wants and where it's going, what it stands for, and that's all I have to say. I still don't have a sense of it, because it is very, very, very disparate. And I go continually to our former student, Alex Galloway, who teaches at NYU and who's very much on top of these movements. And I keep checking in with Alex to see if my readings work. I mean, Lacanian is the next person that we all have to tackle, because as Alex Galloway says, Lacanian it's between, in this younger philosophical theoretical generation, the battle is going to be between Laruelle and Meillassoux. Laruelle makes Meillassoux look like Sunday school. Okay.
Right.
All right. The first question, look, this is, I could talk for half an hour or more. I mean, it is my feeling as a feminist that not enough attention has been paid to the Lacanian real, that the Lacanian real as impossibility, as the inhuman, not the impossibility, but the inhuman, has produced, and our not having come to grips with it, has produced immense violence. And I say as a feminist because, of course, sexual difference is part of this theorization, and that sexual difference is connected with the cut of the real, and that and Joan Kopchak has written so beautifully about all of this, and that the swerve into gender, which I was guilty like a lot of people, took a lot of pressure away from the violence of the ontological cut. Of course, it's argued that it's not an ontological cut, but that's, whatever. So I do think that that this latest refusal to okay, we're finished with subjectivity. We've done it. We know that consciousness is all about correlation, and subjectivity is all about correlation, and we're just going to move on now and do the really important things and take care of climate change and capitalism and so forth and so on. And I think it's a huge mistake. And I was saying to, I think it was Bonnie and Adi a while ago, that the more I read this stuff, the more I become a vulgar feminist, so. If that answers that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, thank you. The next question is David.
So I also wanted to say thank you very much for these terrific papers to begin with. I'm trying to think about them like a dog. I'm almost there. But the word that comes to mind when I try to think like a dog is the word worry. Which perhaps in French we'd say s'acharner, it's something like that. And listening to your paper to begin with, Thangam, there was a sense in which you presented things in a somewhat docile manner, and that was one of the words you used when you were talking about Sartre's characterization of Flaubert. But you were also worrying the concept of the animal, right? There was from the start to the end, there was an intense type of, you weren't going to leave it alone, right, till you got to the end. So in terms of the rhetorical docility or violence of that, I guess that's what I'm coming to. How do we characterize that? And I wanted to put that into contrast with what seemed to be Elizabeth's different type of worrying, which the speculative realists seem to force upon us, so that it becomes a generational worry. It becomes the fact that you get people all the way through to Catherine Malabou writing about Meillassoux that we can't just drop Kant like this. It's not that easy. And then, as Elizabeth is suggesting, you can get a whole new generation that comes along and just drops that bone, right? Walks away and says, we can start again with something else. So I don't know what my question is. It's a sense of how. Is there a responsibility that we have to keep worrying through everything from Kant to Deleuze, or can a younger person simply come along and say, enough of this already, I'm going to look elsewhere? Or in the case of of the animal, is there a way in which the concerns that the human would have about the animal would ever be different from a type of, could ever extract themselves from a type of carnality that is related to a violence in the final analysis? Is there a way that we can approach that differently? So if that's a question, it's a question. It's a dog's question.
Do you want to respond?
Yes. I wish I could bark. Bark angrily. Yes, thank you. Certainly it was about worrying. I'm not sure actually if I understand what you mean by the docility part, but certainly it was about worrying and the êtres agués. If I had had more time, I would have spoken of that. I mean, I wanted to end things with the Deleuze quote because this really describes the dog's disquiet, the dog's constantly anxious state as a fuller kind of perception, to say things quickly. A perception, a very apprehensive duration where it is precisely that you see, that is precisely where the event happens. That is where you see pleasure turning to pain. I mean, that is where you see something arriving or something about to happen. And so I suppose in some sense I was trying to keep open that kind of space of the êtres agués through the paper, which necessarily causes, which means that every sentence seems to carry its own carry the dangers of conceptual closure, and so, I mean, this is why I had to do this rhetorical thing, which is that the dog constantly unsettles the concept, and I have to run after it. But in the end, I may have worried away the dog or something. I'm not sure whether I still have it at the end. So I don't know. I can only answer quite confusedly, partly because perhaps I'm thinking very much with Derrida's l'animal que donc je suis, and therefore there's a certain kind of the being and the following there takes this sort of form. I don't know if I actually have much to. Yeah, I may have to think more about your question, actually.
Can I just say one word? I love it because Measu does not worry, and anxiety is of course the one affect that that Lacan and company point to, and when I said that Measu's defensive grandiosity. His grandiosity is a defense. I meant that. I mean, grandiosity is a psychoanalytic defense against vulnerability and so forth. And so I think that there's something about this work that I have been reading where I see very little worry. Anxieties that are displaced and transformed into other things, but none of. And I think about: is there such a thing as a grandiose dog? I don't know.
But I know when you say he doesn't worry in terms of anxiety, but he worries a problem. I mean, if you read him on Mallarmé's Un coup de dé, that text it's like hermeneutic
I read it, yes.
madness. The necessity to get to this point where we have the number, right?
Yeah.
But that's the sort of dog-like worrying that I'm referring to.
Okay, so it's a different reading than I have, because yes, I've read that, and I think that it's more a control it's determination.
Yeah. He won't let the bone go.
Determination is different from the worry of the dog, it seems to me. I mean, there's no slippage, right? I don't know, but it's a different reading, yeah.
Okay, I'll put you on the queue. So I have, just so everyone knows the queue, I have Jacques, and then Leela, and then Adi, and now Ravit. And we're going to go another 20 minutes. So see what happens. Go ahead, Jacques.
Thank you. Is this thing on? No. Better? Okay. Thank you to both of those.
Just put it closer.
Or I'll just scream.
It's on.
So this is a question for Thangam. And some of this we've sort of talked a little bit.
Can't hear you. It is on, and if you just put it closer to your mouth, we can hear you.
Talked a little bit about this sort of before, but quite interested about this particular point, and particularly the way in which you use various examples to think about the missing, which I found just extremely compelling. Missing as opposed to something like the fragmentary or the brevity of the concept of the dog, or any other sort of term that you would sort of use. But what I'm interested in is how the literary sort of works for you, and given sort of the way our circumstances here, to sort of think of that in terms of its relation to the political, or what it seems to be doing politically. And maybe a larger sort of question is then, how does aesthetic sort of thought then operate for you in thinking about the missing? I mean, there were a couple of things that just I was free associating. One could say like the Lacanian gaze as a kind of there where one is not looking in a painting is a kind of missing that follows one. And also, I think this is in some of the examples, but particularly in the Rollin that you translate. I'm speaking specifically to the words that you use in the translation. But it can happen that the early signs are misleading, that this expectation is disappointed, the scene or passage in question giving you then the impression that there are dogs missing. So the way in which there's a kind of givenness of experience and of thinking about aesthetic reflection as not necessarily appropriating, as disinterested, but in some way a kind of relation to that which is given, and perhaps turning in some way to what Elizabeth had sort of raised in her talk, the question of the for us, the givenness would sort of be almost a kind of the desuetude, or the kind of almost the sort of seeing of that kind of reality negligently, and that in itself is a kind of important capacity of aesthetic reflection. So maybe to put it in much more sort of very sort of like basic terms, how did the literary then sort of work for you in constructing that kind of notion of the missing as important here for the question of the dog, the question of the animal?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. It's actually because I find it difficult to think, sort of to think about things with concepts in a sort of whole, yeah, in that, well, in a conceptual manner that I sort of have to inhabit immanently the way I do certain kinds of texts. And I don't mean to sort of make some kind of psychoanalytic statement about myself, but to talk about Constitution, which is the chapter of, which is the title of that first section of Sartre's book on Flaubert. But so the backstory here is that for the longest time I've been trying to write a chapter about dogs, and I have chapters on various animals, and the dog chapter has just been humblingly difficult. It has been incredibly difficult, maddeningly difficult, yes, and it's partly for some of the reasons I try to approach here. In fact, this is the first time I've sort of tried to go this far in addressing what is so difficult about the dog. Part of it has to do with a method that I developed in response to the question of the animal and the difficulty of the question of the animal, which is that I thought I would pretend with each chapter to be following an animal. That is, pretend to consider that the animal could be the addition of a certain number of textual versions I would find of it. So that somehow, if you added the intertexts on the animal, you would get to something. So it's a strange sort of method, of course, and so on the one hand, it's almost there are two things going on in a sense. You think, how many passages about dogs should I line up? How many dogs should I line up to get to the concept of a dog? And on the other hand, how many concepts would I have to line up to get to the dog? So, of course, both lead you in kind of in both are sort of impossible to close kinds of sets. So the literary and the political, yes, I suppose the conceit of having two voices in a sense, or having a dog planting its portraits in my reading was a way of yes, I suppose a way of suggesting that there are it's very difficult for me to say in any terms other than what I've come up with, but that there are places in our texts where something else is going on, where there are places, and so there's a whole archive of this in a sense, and it would involve reading differently, reading in a certain way, and once you've I can't seem to say anything today about this, so. But a lovely question. In fact, both questions are lovely, but I need much more time to think. Thank you.
I sometimes find concepts similarly muting. It's one of the fun and challenges of this project, I think. Okay, so Leela. Can you stand up, please, so maybe we could hear you? Do you mind? Oh, okay, that's good.
Speak into a microphone.
Yeah.
That's much. Well, thank you very much. Just run at risk of passing out sleepiness. But a question for Elizabeth, apropos missing. Thank you for, actually, it was a very richly conceptual paper. Quite apart from the anxiety, let me call it canine, about the extremely limited philosophical terrain of Meursault's genealogy, I want to put before you another anxiety about the oversaturation of the concept of the real within that genealogy. For what is there except the real in that tradition? You know, whether it is uppercase real or metaphysical real or ontological real or Humean real or empiricist real or materialist or affective or liberal or positivist. I was wondering if it would be possible for you to reflect on the availability from other neighboring philosophical terrains of the accent of the unreal or the illusory nature of everything, non-existence. I think missing evokes that, using the dissident figure of the animal to create a hole in this established genealogy, to take us to the path of the real. And as a footnote, let me simply cite Robert Pippin working again into a caninely provoking limited terrain, but nonetheless pointing us to the fact that the problem in Western philosophy, Hegel being example number one, is the impossibility of conceding non-being. So that's just a rambling question about what would you have to say about unreality and what might the philosophical sources
I
of
am
that be?
absolutely the wrong person to ask. I was listening to Thangam thinking, oh yes, that's the only way I can think. I mean, I have an exceedingly difficult time thinking with philosophers because the concept is just not something I'm comfortable with. And as I said when I started, I went into French literature because I wanted vraisemblance. I did not want truth or reality. I mean, these are not, it seems to me these are interesting fantasies. Reality is a working fantasy in addition to all of the other things that it is. I mean, it's also something that one uses, one names something reality and then does something about it. But in my little limited way of thinking, which is a literary kind of way of thinking, reality is a signifier that has certain kinds of interest, but not anything that I would go so far as to talk about unreality. I mean, so the unreality would be missing, would be what precisely it's the missing. That's because if you're going to have an unreality, you have to have a reality, and that's not my world. So I'm sorry, I'm not the person to answer your very interesting question.
I am. The Lacanian real isn't something. It is an impediment. So it is a kind of a blockage. So it isn't something, and it can't be listed with the other kinds of real, I think, that you were pointing to. And it is precisely, it doesn't exist. It's not something, it's not a matter of existence. It's insistence. I mean, there's lots more to say about the Lacanian real. I'm very glad to hear it introduced because it makes it's a big intervention, and I hope it continues. Yes. Does that answer? I mean, it doesn't really fully elaborate on the Lacanian real, but I think it is an answer to what you're looking for.
That's extremely helpful. I was thinking of the concept of Maya, of the illusory nature of the world, but I stand corrected that the Lacanian real is different from the taxonomies. Thank you very much.
I think there may be a question there of over and under saturation that we could come back to, but during the course of our 2 days. The next question comes from Adi.
May I ask two questions?
No.
To each? No.
No.
So this is a question for Thangam. Maybe it's completely obvious, and or maybe I completely misunderstood you, but I heard you speaking about the dog, the missing stray dog, as an allegory for the concept.
Yeah.
So concepts are stray and missing. And so this is the first question, and then the following question is, aren't we lucky that the concepts are missing? Because if they were not missing, we would have nothing to say.
Actually, I don't think I was suggesting that the stray dogs were allegories for concepts. though something about their missing allows one to think of the stray dog, but I was rather interested in the fact that in a very overdetermined way, the animal has been opposed to the concept. And so in a way, thinking the animal is to think the missing of concepts. I mean, I was and it can be another way of I mean, it can be my way of thinking. It's my way of thinking myself then into concepts, because in no other way could I do so. So missing is my way of so that becomes the way into concepts. Yeah. But the frame would still be the very long history that opposes the animal to the concept. Yeah.
So I'm sorry, the last question will have to be from Ravit. If you could be a little brief, but pose your question, and then we'll close the session. I'll have a quick comment at the end.
Yeah, can people hear? Great. First of all, these were fantastic and thought-provoking papers, so to add my thanks to both of you. I wanted to ask you, Thangam, to just talk a little more about the political implications of missing. I mean, which is in a sense that's precisely what you did. But even more, I actually wanted you to come back to the Sartre passage, right? Because one of the things that comes out here, not just sort of conceptually, but quite kind of pragmatically or plot-wise, or socially perhaps, right, in the scene of sitting and talking and having this dog be in some weird way interpolated but not, is a kind of narrative arc of fear and rage that then comes back to docility, right? And to me, in a very strange way, the entire passage hinges on that phrase in the last sentence, which is once calmed, right? Once calmed, he came back to lick our hands. So is that in some way, is that one way to think the politics of the concept of missing, right? Insofar as missing in this example is not Alan Beck's missing of never being in the presence of, like when the dogs are out, the people are in, when the people are out, the dogs are in, or the dogs are hidden, right? But here, dogs and humans are in the presence of each other, right? But in a non-comprehending way, or in a way that is perhaps anthropomorphic, or in some sense. But there's so many ways in which I think that this passage tends toward the political. You know, in a way, I find myself tangled up into how to start to tease out the political valences. Just wondering if you could start that a little bit for me.
Yes, thank you, Ravit. Another lovely question. I want to address all questions to all of you, because I think you're doing some lovely thinking, and I'm just sort of exhausted, so I can't seem to say much. But I suppose the difficulty of the dog for me is that it is political. You know, I mean, it was more political than any of the. I mean, it was more political than I had expected to have to be dealing with in this project on animals, which is mostly sort of literary and philosophical, obviously with the horizon of extinction being an inescapable one. So in that big sense, political, but I was not expecting the smaller, more nagging, worrying kinds of ways in which the dog would be sort of ineradicably political. And there are some unrigorous answers here, and one of them would be that with the dog, my corpus itself seems to have exploded. I mean, it was initially supposed to be, it is a project about the contemporary French novel, but the dog, and particularly once it revealed, once I started to realize that one of the divides in the dog is, of course, between the pet dog and the stray dog, I suddenly realized that there was a shadow to every dog, and to every dog you can see, because and thus coinciding with shadows in me, because I work on French literature and I live in Providence, but I do come from a country that abounds in stray dogs, and in fact in the city I often return to, there is one stray dog for every 37 humans, and it's funny because of course I had never expected to think about the stray dog conceptually. I mean, I live in concepts here, and I live with stray dogs there, and so so in a way, the dog chapter sort of opened that breach. Trick. I mean, and I was tricked in that sense, and I had to encounter I had to try to think together these two things, and so. So there's that. There's another thing I wanted to say about the stray dog. Let me just think. I should end. Okay. Yeah. Yes. In any case, in this passage, it does seem to me that the passage sort of it needs to close in a sense. It needs to close with that licking, the frolicking and the licking, because in some ways that is that's something so unbearable in that moment that in a sense a text itself, a text could not bear it, let alone a being. Something like that. So thank you all for lovely questions.
Thank you both for lovely papers. I want to just close with a final comment, and then we can continue discussion informally a bit over coffee, taking my bearings from Thangam's Red Queen regarding the dog who loses its temper when its bone is taken away. The Queen says if the dog went away, its temper would remain. And I want to say, after these papers, that we can say, too, if the human went away, its temper would remain. If collective action goes away, its temper and temptation would remain. So the question for us is, what does it mean to remain? And what taking away, what bone gone missing, is postulated by the idea of remains. So with that, thank you. Let's go for coffee.